I didn't lose the 3-point matter project because I messed up. I lost it because I did everything right. 1 week after the contract was signed, my company took it from me, reassigned it for strategic reasons, and told me to stay professional. I remember standing in the glass conference room with my laptop still open, staring at my own kickoff deck like it belonged to someone else. The ink on the SOW wasn't even dry. The client had literally emailed, "We're excited to build this with you." And I had forwarded it to my wife like it was proof that all those late nights meant something. Then leadership pulled me aside and said, "We're making a change." And a week later, one woman on the client side made them turn pale. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm not a sales guy. I'm the person sales drags into the room when the client starts asking the questions that can't be answered with confidence and a smile. Solutions architect by title, project lead in practice. I live in the boring parts, requirements, risk registers, timelines that don't lie, and the ugly truth of what it takes to actually deliver what the pitch promises. This project was the biggest win of my career. It wasn't a lottery ticket, it was months of grind. The client was a regional healthcare network with 12 locations, outdated systems, constant compliance pressure, and a leadership team that had been burned before. They weren't shopping for a vendor. They were shopping for someone they could blame if things went wrong, which meant they were terrified of picking the wrong partner. The initial ask was simple on paper: consolidate scheduling, billing, and patient intake across all sites, integrate with 2 legacy databases, and meet specific reporting requirements for audits. Every company we competed against showed up with the same glossy pitch deck and the same accelerators. The client didn't want accelerators. They wanted to know what happened on day 73 when the integration started throwing errors, and the clinics were calling at 6:30 a.m., screaming that appointments were disappearing. So I leaned into the uncomfortable details. I asked questions nobody loves hearing. What data was clean? What data was political? Which workflows were the way we do it versus the way we do it because the last vendor made us? I built a deliverable plan with contingencies. I flagged risks early in writing. I refused to promise a timeline I couldn't defend. On one call, their CFO actually said, "You're the first person who's told me no without sounding like you're hiding something." That was the moment I thought, okay, this might actually happen. When we got to the pricing, I didn't let leadership dump a number on the table and pray. I worked with our PMO to map the staffing model, line by line. I sat with an implementation manager at 9 p.m. on a Thursday to re-estimate the integration work, because I didn't like how optimistic the draft was. I wrote the scope language in a way that protected both sides. I pushed back when sales tried to slide in future phases as vague placeholders. Not because I'm noble, because vague scope is where projects go to die, and I didn't want this thing hanging around my neck for the next year. The week the client asked for final presentations, our VP of sales was suddenly everywhere. He hadn't been on half the calls, but he showed up smiling, shaking hands, telling stories. He called the client's CEO by his first name, like they were friends. Afterward, he slapped me on the back and said, "Great work. We couldn't do this without you." I didn't take it personally. That's how the game works. I just wanted the win. We won. The email came through at 7:12 a.m. on a Tuesday. "Congratulations. We're moving forward with your firm." Their procurement lead attached the award letter and asked for final contract signatures by end of week. I was in my kitchen when I read it. I reread it twice because I didn't trust my own eyes. Then I just stood there, staring at the screen, feeling this weird, quiet relief in my chest, like something heavy had finally been set down. At work, people acted like we'd won a championship. Sales rang a bell. Someone ordered pastries. My manager shook my hand and said, "This is huge for you." He wasn't lying. He knew what it meant. He'd seen me absorb every uncomfortable question, every tense call, every late-night revision because the client needed one more risk mitigation plan before they could convince their board. 2 days later, I got the calendar invite for the internal kickoff. Subject line: Project Phoenix Delivery Kickoff. I built the agenda. I wrote the first version of the timeline. I drafted the onboarding checklist for their clinics. I even started picking which engineers had the temperament to work with a nervous client without getting defensive. Then the following Monday at 4:47 p.m., I got another calendar invite. Subject line, quick sync, staffing update. It was from my director, no agenda. Just him, HR, and the VP of Sales. That combination doesn't mean staffing update. It means someone is about to tell you something that's already been decided. The meeting lasted 7 minutes. My director didn't meet my eyes when he started. He said the word realignment 3 times, like repetition would make it sound less like betrayal. The VP of Sales smiled the entire time. HR didn't say much, just wrote notes like we were discussing office supplies. We're moving the project under a different leader, my director said. It's a strategic account. The client relationship is high touch. We think it's best if... The VP cut in, still smiling. We want you focused on supporting the delivery team. You're critical. But we need someone with executive presence at the front. I waited for the part where they said, for the first few weeks, or temporarily, or we'll revisit after kickoff. They didn't. I asked one question carefully because I could already feel my pulse in my throat. Who's leading it? The VP of Sales didn't even hesitate. I am. I'll be the face of it. We're also bringing in Darren as day-to-day. Darren was a program manager who had never been on a single client call. He wasn't incompetent. He just wasn't the reason we won. He didn't know their politics, their risk tolerance, the hidden landmines in their data, or why their CFO's patience snapped when vendors said industry standard. My director added, "You'll still be involved. We just need to position this correctly." Position, like I was a logo. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone. I asked what my role would be. Support, the VP said. Architecture guidance. Be available. We'll loop you in when needed. When needed, like I was a spare tire. I walked back to my desk and stared at my monitor for a long time. People around me were packing up, joking, heading out. I kept replaying one detail, the VP's smile. It wasn't nervous. It wasn't apologetic. It was comfortable, like he'd done this before and expected me to swallow it. I opened my sent folder and scrolled through months of emails, not because I wanted to obsess, but because I needed to make sure I hadn't imagined my own work. It was all there. My notes, my proposals, my risk register, my responses to their procurement questions at 11:30 p.m., my version-controlled scope edits, my call summaries, the moments where I'd said, "We can do that, but here's what it costs," and the client had respected me more for it. I saved copies of everything to our approved internal repository, exactly the way policy required, no drama, no tricks, just making sure there was a record. That night, around 9 p.m., my phone buzzed with an email from the client side. Not the procurement lead, not the CFO, a name I'd seen only once in the CC line during contract review. Subject line, clarification needed, Project Phoenix. And the email was addressed to the VP of Sales, my director, and me. I didn't open that email right away, not because I was scared of what it said, but because I knew what it meant. When someone that senior reaches out with clarification needed in the subject line, it's never about spelling or formatting. It's about alignment. And alignment, in corporate language, is where people get exposed. The message was short. She wrote that she was reviewing internal notes before the formal kickoff and wanted to confirm points of contact and accountability. She asked who would be responsible for architectural decisions, risk sign-off, and scope trade-offs once delivery started. No accusations, no edge, just clean, precise questions. The VP replied within 6 minutes. He thanked her for reaching out, said he'd be leading the engagement at an executive level, and that Darren would be handling day-to-day delivery. He mentioned me once, buried in the middle of a paragraph, as providing support as needed. Support. Again. She didn't respond that night. The next morning, my director stopped by my desk. He closed the distance like someone trying to keep a conversation casual. Said leadership wanted to reset expectations. He explained gently that while I'd been instrumental in pre-sales, delivery was a different phase, different skill set, different optics. I asked him if the client knew that. He paused for half a second too long. They know the structure, he said. They don't need all the details. That was the moment I understood what had actually happened. This wasn't a one-off decision. This was a pattern. Sales closes, delivery absorbs the risk, and whoever is loudest gets credit if it works. If it fails, it quietly becomes someone else's fault. I wasn't being reassigned because I lacked presence. I was being sidelined because I asked questions that couldn't be spun. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten to quit. I did what I've always done when something feels off. I started paying closer attention. Kickoff week arrived. Calendars filled up. Darren sent out his version of the project plan. It looked fine at first glance. Clean Gantt chart, confident milestones, but I noticed what wasn't there. The contingency buffers we'd discussed with the client were gone. The data validation phase had been compressed. A regulatory reporting requirement that had taken us 3 calls to fully understand was reduced to a single bullet point. I flagged it privately. Darren replied with, "Let's not overcomplicate this. We'll adjust if it becomes an issue." That phrase is a red flag. If it becomes an issue is what people say when they don't want to admit something already is. The VP started joining client calls. He talked a lot. He reassured. He promised alignment. Every time the client asked a technical question, he'd glance at me on screen, then answer anyway. Broad, confident, just vague enough to sound safe. I stayed quiet unless directly asked. Not because I had nothing to say, because interrupting him would have turned me into the problem. Then the woman emailed again. This time she asked for a 30-minute call. No subject line theatrics, just availability. She included procurement and legal on CC. That alone shifted the temperature in the room. Before the call, the VP messaged me privately. "Stick to your lane," he wrote. "We've got this." The call started politely. She introduced herself properly this time. She wasn't just on the client side. She was the director of enterprise risk and compliance. Her job was to make sure vendors didn't quietly drift away from what was contracted once the ink dried. She thanked everyone for their time, then asked Darren to walk through the updated delivery approach. He did. Confident, smooth. When he finished, she asked a question that sounded harmless. "Can you explain how the revised timeline accounts for the data integrity risks we discussed during selection?" Darren hesitated. Not long, but enough. He gave a general answer about best practices. She nodded, then asked another. "And who approved that adjustment?" The VP jumped in, said it was an internal optimization, nothing that affected outcomes. She paused. "I'm asking because the mitigation plan we agreed to was a deciding factor for our board," she said. "If that plan changes, we need to reassess." Silence. I could feel it. That subtle shift where confidence drains out of a room. The VP tried to recover, said nothing fundamental had changed, said they were aligned. That's when she said my name. She asked me, directly, to confirm whether the original risk framework I'd presented was still being followed. I answered honestly, calmly, no editorializing. I said parts of it had been deprioritized in the current plan. No drama, just a fact. She thanked me, then ended the call early. Afterward, my director called me immediately, asked why I'd said that. I told him because it was true. He said I should have handled it internally. I asked how, since no one had responded to my written concerns. He didn't have an answer. That afternoon, procurement requested documentation, not from sales, from delivery, from me, original scope language, risk logs, decision rationales. I sent exactly what they asked for. Nothing more, nothing less. I didn't know it yet, but that decision would cost them everything. By the end of the week, meetings were being rescheduled. Emails were getting tighter. Legal language started creeping into conversations that used to be casual. People stopped smiling as much, And for the first time since the realignment, no one told me to stay in my lane. By Monday morning, the project didn't feel like a win anymore. It felt like a liability everyone was trying to quietly move away from. The director of enterprise risk didn't email again. Instead, her team did. The request was formal. A shared folder, a checklist, dates, version history. They wanted to understand decision drift between contract signature and delivery kickoff. That phrase mattered. Drift implies movement without permission. Leadership tried to take control. The VP scheduled an internal call labeled Alignment Reset. He spoke first, longer than necessary, framing everything as a misunderstanding. He said the client was being overly cautious. He said this was normal. He said we just needed to get ahead of the narrative. I watched faces on the screen. No one nodded. Darren looked uncomfortable. Not guilty, just exposed. He hadn't made malicious choices. He'd followed instructions. Simplify, compress, deliver. The system rewarded that, until it didn't. Mid-call, legal joined. That never happens by accident. They asked for a timeline of approvals. Who changed what? When? And under whose authority? The VP answered in broad strokes. Legal asked again, more precisely. I didn't speak until asked. When I answered exactly. Dates, emails, meeting notes. I wasn't indicting anyone. I was reconstructing reality. That afternoon, the client froze all non-essential work. No more build, no more prep. Pending review. Sales panicked. They started floating words like partnership, flexibility, goodwill. The director of risk didn't respond. Instead, she scheduled a review with her executive committee. Vendor performance was now an agenda item. That was the moment it tipped from internal politics to consequences. 2 days later, I was invited to that meeting, not as a presenter, as a resource. The VP found out an hour before. He messaged me twice, asked what I'd shared. I told him the same thing I'd told everyone else, documentation they already had access to. The meeting was quiet, no theatrics. The woman led it like someone used to cleaning up messes other people pretended weren't there. She walked through the agreed scope, the risk framework, and then showed the deviations, side by side. No commentary needed. Then she asked a single question. Who was accountable for maintaining this alignment? No one answered. She thanked me for my work during selection, said the board had trusted my assessment. Then she said something that shifted everything. We select vendors based on people, not logos. When those people are removed without disclosure, that's a material change. Material. That word belongs to contracts. By Friday, the company was scrambling. Leadership calls ran late. Legal drafted explanations. Sales tried to reinsert themselves. Darren was pulled off client-facing work entirely, quietly. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired. The kind of tired that comes from being right when being right costs you something. Then my director called. He didn't hedge this time. He said the client wanted me reinstated as lead, or they'd reopen vendor discussions. The VP didn't join that call. Neither did HR. That's when I knew the damage was already done. They thought I was gone. I wasn't. The reinstatement never happened. Not officially. Leadership floated it like a concession, a way to calm the client down without admitting fault. But by then, the conversation had already moved past titles and org charts. The client didn't want a reshuffle. They wanted assurance that what happened wouldn't happen again. And my company couldn't give that without admitting how the decision was made in the first place. 2 days after that call, procurement sent a notice of conditional suspension. No penalties yet, just a pause. A reminder that the contract allowed them to walk if material terms or key personnel changed without disclosure. Legal read it 3 times before replying. Sales read it once and went silent. The director of enterprise risk called me directly that afternoon. Not to strategize, not to vent, to thank me. She said my documentation had saved them weeks of uncertainty. That when vendors collapse under pressure, it's usually because no one can explain how they got from promise to reality. I could, calmly, cleanly, without rewriting history. Then she said something that surprised me. "We assumed you'd be defensive," she said. "Most people are." I told her I wasn't interested in defending anything that couldn't stand on its own. There was a pause on the line, not awkward, thoughtful. By the end of the week, the company got its answer. The client didn't terminate. They didn't renegotiate either. They reduced scope. The high visibility executive layer the VP had inserted himself into, gone. The optional expansion phases sales had quietly counted on, removed. The contract still existed, but it was smaller, tighter, and far less forgiving. And the client named me, by name, in the revised key personnel section. That clause couldn't be ignored. Internally, there was no apology, no acknowledgement, just a calendar update moving the project under a different cost center. The VP stopped attending delivery calls altogether. Darren was reassigned to internal work. My director avoided eye contact for a week. Then HR scheduled a career conversation. They framed it as growth, as opportunity. They said my skill set might be better appreciated elsewhere. I agreed. 3 weeks later, I resigned. Not dramatically. No exit speech. Just a clean handover and a quiet goodbye to the people who'd actually done the work. I already had an offer. The client's consulting partner, one I'd met during diligence, had been watching the situation closely. They didn't offer me a rescue. They offered me autonomy. Different logo. Same project. Clear authority. On my last day, I packed my desk while the office hummed around me. No one stopped me. No one needed to. The outcome was already written. The company kept the project, technically. They lost the trust. A month later, I heard the VP had moved on, framed as a mutual decision. It usually is. The woman from Enterprise Risk sent me a short note after go live. One sentence. "Everything is working the way you said it would." That was enough. I didn't get revenge. I got my name back.